We're in the third week of a series. The first 2 weeks, Pastor Dan spoke, and we've been covering the Gospel of Matthew. What we're doing is we're going to read the Bible together. We're going to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts. So we want to encourage all of you to join us. So if you haven't started yet, don't worry about it. Just pick up with us in the Gospel of Mark starting this week. You read about 3 verses a day. Every once in a while, you'll have to read 4. So we'd love to encourage you to join us on the journey. I get to speak about my second favorite gospel, the Gospel of Mark. It's very powerful. The thing I like about Mark the most is it's full of action. In fact, the Greek adverb for hurry, you'll find it 42 times. It's translated different ways. Sometimes it's translated immediately or at once. Reading the Gospel of Mark is like watching an action movie because he doesn't mess around with insignificant details like Jesus' birth, genealogies, anything like that. He gets right down to business. In fact, in chapter 1, he already heals 3 people. And in fact, when he talks about sermons, Matthew slows down and takes 3 entire chapters to talk about one sermon of Jesus. Mark doesn't do that. Mark gets right down to business. He gives us more comments about what Jesus said than what he actually said. So what Mark might do is say, Jesus taught with authority like nobody else did. The Gospel of Mark is very powerful. It's practical. It's down to earth. In my opinion, it's by far the most personal. Even though it's fast and action-packed, it's personal because Mark got his information directly from Peter. And Peter gives eyewitness details that we wouldn't get anywhere else. He tells about how Jesus stoops down and picks the little children up and all kinds of other examples. One thing that'll help you as you're interpreting the Bible is whenever the editor slows down and gives you some really important comments, it'll help you to understand what's going on in the passage. Just want to give you a couple. As you're reading along, slow down and see what the author says. And what Mark does is he tells a story. He tells about this paralyzed guy and how he was healed, and then he listens to the crowd, and this is what everyone did. We've never seen anyone else like this before, ever. You get to chapter 4, and Peter and the disciples are rowing like crazy. They're terrified. They're scared. And Jesus all of a sudden wakes up, and he says, "Be still," and the storm is still. And the disciples make a statement that just blows his mind, and he says this, "Who is this, that even the winds and the waves obey this guy?" Later on, in chapter 7, there's this guy, and he never could speak, never could hear. And at the end of the encounter, people are whispering in the crowd saying, "He has done everything well." That's about Jesus. He said, "He even makes deaf people hear and mute people speak." There's nobody like this Jesus. Mark wants to let everyone know that the number one characteristic about the disciples is that they're dense. In fact, we get to read all kinds of passages like this where Jesus talks to them, and as he's having a conversation with them, he looks at them and he says, "Are you so dull?" The reason I love that so much is because that's how I feel often. Often when I'm reading the Bible and when I'm trying to implement what God says, I feel like, man, I'm never going to get this right. Does anyone else ever had that experience besides me? Am I the only one that ever feels like you're dense and you have no idea what's going on? That's how I feel when I read the Bible. Mark starts off, in the first 7 chapters, he kind of gives Jesus credentials. He proves that he's the Messiah, and he does it by showing miracle after miracle and all of the main things that Jesus does. The one thing that Mark is impressed with is action way over words. He's the kind of guy that says, "Don't tell me what it is. I want to see what you actually do." And he gives details after details about how awesome Jesus is. And then something changes. By the time we get to chapter 8, and that's where we're going to spend our time. So open your Bibles, if you will, to Mark chapter 8. And as we go through Mark, what Jesus does is he shifts the focus from the crowds and the miracles to one-on-one training with just his disciples. And the crowds are so intense that Jesus can hardly get away from them. In fact, he's constantly trying to hide and get alone with his disciples because he wants to teach them a couple things. They completely misunderstood the message. They had no idea what his mission was. They had no idea what he came to do and what he was hoping to accomplish. In fact, they were completely off base on almost everything. He gets done feeding 5,000 men, and then pretty soon, a couple weeks later, he feeds 4,000 men. So just so you know, that means probably about 15,000 people at the first feeding, 12,000 people at least at the second one. Can you just imagine that? 12,000 people. He gets done feeding them. The Pharisees, who were the religious people in that day, they were kind of the bad guys. They came up to Jesus, and as soon as he got done doing a massive miracle, they stopped him, and they confronted him and said, "Who gives you the authority to do this kind of stuff?" Jesus, Mark gives an interesting detail that only someone who was there would notice. Jesus sighs deeply and says, "I'm not going to tell you." And then he gets in the boat, and that's where we pick up in Mark chapter 8, verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread. Have you ever tried to communicate something really important to someone, and no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't get the message across? Has anyone ever tried to communicate something extremely important to you, and no matter how you tried, you never could quite understand what they were saying? Well, here is Jesus trying to make them understand something so important, and no matter how he tries, they never quite get exactly what he says. Watch what happens. Verse 14, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread. They get in the boat, they're headed across the shore, and the only thing they can focus on is the fact that they don't have any food with them. Man, I can relate to those guys. I can relate because that's how my mind works. When I'm hungry, I can't think about anything else. Except for the one loaf they had with them in the boat. They did an assessment of how much food they had. They had one loaf. That's all they could think about. Jesus says, and he warned them, "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." He's trying to teach them and warn them about something important. Yeast is something that would put in bread, and it's a game changer. It would entirely change everything. And Jesus said, there's something that the Pharisees believe, and there's something that Herod believes, and that thing will change everything for you. I want you to pay attention. I want you to watch out for that. He's trying to communicate something extremely important to his disciples. Verse 16, they discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we don't have any bread." As you're listening to me, I want you to try to figure out what the yeast of the Pharisees that Jesus was trying to warn them about. Verse 17, aware of their discussion, Jesus knew what was going on. He asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand?" Jesus constantly says, "Are you so dull? Why don't you get it? Why aren't you paying attention to what I'm saying? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember?" And now Jesus is going to back up a little bit. He's going to review what's taken place over the last couple weeks and give them some of the highlights so that they can catch what's really going on. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you pick up? He says, remember when there were 15,000 people out there? And we had a couple loaves and we had some fishes. How many baskets were left? And the disciples respond to him and they say, there was 12 of them, they replied. By the way, there was 12 disciples and each one of them had a basket full. And they're going, "Oh yeah, I remember when you did that." And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketful pieces did you pick up? And if you don't quite pay attention to what's going on, this is a different word for basket. The first one is one that you can put in your hands. The second one is the same size basket that the Apostle Paul hid in later in the book of Acts, which is probably at least this big. So this time, they had 7 baskets full, and the disciples going, "Oh yeah, I remember that." 7 of them, they said. He said to them, "Do you guys still not get it?" Oh, I love this because that's exactly how I am. Have you ever read the Bible? Have you ever tried to do what God wants you to do? And no matter what you're trying to do, you never quite get it right? Oh, I feel like sometimes I'm dense and slow and don't quite understand exactly what God wants me to. And that's exactly how the disciples were. Now, Jesus is teaching, and he asks them an important question. He says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Some say that you're John the Baptist. Some say that you're Elijah. Some say that you're a prophet. And then Jesus gets personal. He says, who do you say that I am? And Peter, who's always putting his feet in his mouth, says, you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. You are the promised one. And in Matthew's gospel, he goes to great detail saying he got it right. And this statement's so important, I can build my church on it, and the gates of hell will never even prevail against it. But because Peter's giving us the information, and he, by this time, has gotten a little bit of humility, when he tells Mark the story, Mark leaves out all of the compliments. Now, Jesus is about to define who he is and what his mission is about. And before we get in there, I want you to think to yourself, what was Jesus' mission to do? Why did he come to earth, and what was he hoping to accomplish? Because I'm afraid just as dull as the disciples were, sometimes we are, and sometimes we get confused and we don't understand. Jesus knew that he was about to leave, and he had to empower his disciples so that they could take the ball and carry it from here forward. He needed to know that they knew exactly who he was and what he was accomplishing and what their role in what he was doing was. And they had no idea. So he slows them down, and I can imagine this conversation took a while, and he said to them, then he began to teach them, the Son of Man, listen to this, must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and then he will be killed. And then after 3 days, he will rise again. He spoke plainly about this. So Jesus is slowing them down and saying, okay, I want to make sure you understand the mission. I am going to suffer, get rejected, then I'm going to get killed. And Peter does exactly what I would do because he was clueless. I can imagine him pulling Jesus aside and saying to him, hey, Jesus, could you knock off the negative talk? I mean, you got massive crowds. We've been following you for a while, and now we're starting to build momentum. You need to not say that kind of stuff, because when you start talking about suffering and dying, no one's going to want to participate in that nonsense. And I can imagine him pulling him aside quietly and saying, hey, Jesus, would you stop talking about that stuff? Can you imagine what it would be like to rebuke Jesus? So Peter's rebuking Jesus, saying, you have no idea what you're talking about, Jesus. Knock it off. But when Jesus turned, he looked at his disciples, and then he rebuked Peter. The same exact words that Jesus used to rebuke demons. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Last week, Pastor Dan talked about the difference between God's perspective and our perspective. So we're not going to focus a lot of time there, so we're going to keep moving on. Then he called the crowd, and in my opinion, this is the hinge verse in the entire Gospel of Mark. This verse is where everything changes, because up until this time, it's been proving his credentials, and then now he's going to clarify for the crowds, for the disciples, for everyone. Some of you have not chosen to follow Jesus yet, and that's okay. We're so glad you're here. And I want to make sure that you understand exactly what Jesus was offering his disciples, because Jesus had a clear message to them about what it meant and what their role in the mission was. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he said, whoever wants to be my disciple, listen to this, must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. They must put aside their own personal agenda. Remember, he had just said that he was going to suffer, get rejected, and die? So following him meant that what I want you to know is that if you follow me, if you choose to do that, that could mean that you're going to suffer, get rejected, and have to die, because you're going to take up your cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Every single one of us wants to save our lives. And so did they. They wanted to protect themselves. They wanted everything to work out for themselves. They were all about them all the time. And Jesus says, I want to make sure you understand that to follow me means that you're going to have to lose your life in order to gain it. Watch what he says. Verse 36. What good is it if someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit your soul? Even if you get everything and it costs you your soul, what good is it? Some of you, what I would ask you to do this week is to actually think about that question. What if I got everything I wanted, but it cost me my soul. Would it be worth it? Verse 37, or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous generation, then I'll be ashamed of them, and we're not going to talk about that because that really scares us. But here's what I want you to think, because just prior to this teaching, Jesus had healed this blind man, and at first the blind man couldn't see. He could see things kind of clearly, but everything was blurry, and then Jesus talked to him and said, how can you see? And then all of a sudden, his eyes were completely open and he understood. And I think that Jesus is using the exact same thing. He's saying to them, you guys are blind. You have no idea what it is I'm talking about. And you completely, utterly, entirely miss what I'm talking about. You see, they thought that Jesus' mission was about a crown. They thought that the reason Jesus came was so he could be a victorious, conquering hero that would reign on a throne. They thought that the reason Jesus came was so that he could take charge and he could be in charge of everyone. But I want you to see, before we go any further, that Jesus had a different mission than that. You see, Jesus' mission was the cross. And he was going to be a humble servant, a humble suffering servant that would experience rejection, suffering, and death. And some of you that have not made the decision to follow Jesus, you said, I knew there was a reason why I didn't decide to do that. I knew there was a reason why I did not decide, I've never decided to follow Jesus. Jesus was making sure that everyone understood exactly what he was calling people to do. Let's continue. Now, in order for you to understand this, Jesus had sent out disciples, and he sent them out 2 by 2, and he sent them in pairs, and he told them to go do some stuff. And one of the things that he wanted them to do was go and rebuke demons from people, because this was like advanced training. This wasn't for people that were just first day on the job. This was like messenger boot camp on steroids. Jesus is telling them that here's what I want you guys to do. I want you to go out there and do it. And they've been out trying it, but they were so unsuccessful that nobody wanted to brag about anything. Have you ever talked to people or you heard testimonies and everyone else kind of follows God, goes out and everything works great, and they tell all kinds of stories about God parts the mountains and everything goes great and everything's awesome? The truth is that most of the time whenever I go out and do stuff, I am a miserable failure, and people don't accept Christ, and they don't necessarily even listen to me, and sometimes people are even frustrated or upset. Well, watch what happens to the disciples. Not only does it not work, but this guy in the crowd points it out to Jesus. Watch what happens. A man in the crowd answered, Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit, has been robbed of his speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him into the ground. He foams at the mouth. He gnashes his teeth, becomes rigid. Can you imagine if you were a parent and that was your kid? If your kid was experiencing that, it would be so terrifying, you would do anything to get it to stop. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they couldn't do it. This is important because later on we're going to come back to this. This guy comes to Jesus and he said, hey, I asked your disciples. I wanted him to. He was like the perfect guy. Imagine someone that doesn't know Jesus and they come up to you and they say, is there any way you could tell me how to receive Jesus? Pretty much you can't mess it up because all they want to do is to get the information. And they come up, this guy comes up to Jesus and tells his disciples in front of Jesus that they couldn't do it at all. Watch Jesus' response. This is the normal response to Jesus to his disciples. Are you starting to feel better about yourself? Because I am. As I read Mark's gospel, I love it because it portrays the way things really are. Jesus says to his disciples, you unbelieving generation. He replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. I can imagine Jesus going, I've been with you guys for over a year now. In fact, I've been with you almost 2 years. I've been training you, teaching you, showing you, and you can't get anything right at all. Wow, I feel way better about myself now. Bring the boy to me, he says. After Jesus, and we're going to skip forward. Jesus ends up casting out the demon out of this guy. And then, verse 28, after Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, okay, Jesus, why couldn't we do anything? Why were we so unsuccessful? And Jesus replied graciously, this kind comes only out by prayer. We're going to come back to this in a minute. It seems like it doesn't fit the story of where we're going, but it's really important detail that'll make sense in a few minutes. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know where they were. The reason Jesus didn't want anyone to know where they were is he was in the midst of trying to train his disciples. And can you imagine Jesus' frustration? He's constantly trying to teach them, and they're not getting it. They are so dull. They don't remember anything. They have no idea what's going on, and he keeps trying to communicate. So now he starts shutting the crowds off, and he gets one-on-one with his disciples, trying to teach them an important message. Because he was teaching his disciples, he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he'll rise. He's trying to bring it back to his mission and where he's headed. Verse 32. But they did not understand what he meant. But now they're afraid to ask him because they're like, we have no idea, Jesus, what you're talking about. This message about suffering, being rejected, going to the cross and dying, that doesn't make any sense. And by the way, we don't want any part of it, but we're not going to even ask you. This is what I really love, verse 33. They came to Capernaum. Mark's gospel's not so much about chronological order, but it's about geography, and now they're moving further south towards Jerusalem in the story. It's kind of thematically designed. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them. Now, Jesus gets the crowd completely away from him, and I can imagine Jesus sitting down, and we find out in a few minutes he does. And he's trying to teach them that he's going to suffer, be killed, and die. And watch what they're doing. I love Jesus. He says to them, what were you guys arguing about? The whole time I'm talking, you guys are arguing about something. What was it? Watch what he says. But they kept quiet because on the way, they had been arguing about who was the greatest. So here's Jesus saying, hey, my mission is about going to the cross. And they're arguing about, hey, I'm better than you are. Hey, I'm more important than you are. I have a more important role than you do. And they're arguing the whole time. And Jesus is so gracious. He waits till he gets them alone in the room. And he says, by the way, tell me what you guys were arguing about. Watch this. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12. And he said, anyone who wants to be first. Now Jesus is really starting to talk nonsense. Anyone who wants to be first. Does anybody here want to be first? Does anyone want it to be about you? Does anyone want people to pay attention to you and your needs and what it is you want? He says, if you want to be first, then you must be the very last. Oh, my goodness. You must be the servant of all. He took a little child whom he placed among them. If you read Mark's gospel, the last time the little children came to him, Jesus' disciples were so clueless that they cast him aside and said, get out of here and quit bugging Jesus. The reason we don't understand this is because in our culture, children have very high importance, and some parents, some of you, do everything for your kids. In fact, your entire life is centered around getting your kids to one sporting event to the other. But back then, kids were seen as an inconvenience, and whenever they would come up, people would kind of get out of here. The important people are here, not you. So what Jesus does is he pulls a child, and the reason he does is because the child was insignificant, had no status, had no value at that time, at least they didn't think so, and he puts him in his arms, and watch what he does. Taking the little child in his arms, and Peter gave Mark these little details. He said to them, whoever welcomes one of these children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me doesn't welcome me, but welcomes the one who sent me. Now, I want us to slow down a little bit. Remember the beginning, we don't see very clearly, and we need to have our eyes open so we can see the clear message. Jesus' mission wasn't to get a crown, but was to go to the cross. Jesus' mission wasn't to reign everybody, but was to humble himself, be rejected, and then eventually have to die. Now he's clarifying about where they fit in the rank and order. Now, when it comes to the rank and order, don't you like to be the most important? Don't you like to be first in line, not last in line? Watch what happens. They wanted to be first, which meant they wanted to have status, power, glory, and honor. And some of you are starting to move around in your seats because this message is uncomfortable and you do not like it. You do not like to be told that following Jesus doesn't mean that you should be in charge, that you should be important, that you should be the first in line. And I'm with you because it makes me uncomfortable as well. I'd just as soon be first instead of last. If I go to a place, I like it when people notice me. If I'm hanging out with people, I like people to pay attention to me. I do not like to be last. But I want you to think about something. Jesus suggested to his followers that when it comes to rank, that you're much better off going underneath, not on top of. We're going to talk a little bit about application in a while, but can you imagine how this might change the way you interact with your family and your friends? If instead it's about you getting what you want, that you would consider what they want? We're not going to go there for a while, so you got some time to just breathe. We'll get to that in a minute. Teacher, said John. Now, let's just be reminded, what's Jesus trying to teach them? He's trying to teach them about his mission, where he's headed, what their role in it is. The last time, which is probably a day or so before, they're out trying to cast out demons, and they're miserably unsuccessful. Okay? Now watch what happens. Teacher, said John, we saw someone driving out demons in your name. So here's what we did. We told him to knock it off. Stop that. Have you ever had someone else that's more successful at what it is you want to really be successful at? Do you ever get jealous? I do. Sometimes when people recognize and notice someone else, it kind of makes something inside of me that I wish wasn't there just kind of crawl, because I would rather be getting the recognition than they are. So what they did is we told him to stop because he's not one of us. And they're thinking that Jesus is going to be pleased with this. Watch this. Do not stop him, Jesus says, for no one who does a miracle in my name can the next moment say anything bad about me. For whoever is not against us is for us. Truly I tell you, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name because you belong to the Messiah will certainly not lose their reward. Now they're on their way to Jerusalem. Remember, they started in the north? They got all the way down to Capernaum, and now Jesus is about to take them to Jerusalem. His time for training them is running out, and he only has a few more days to make sure they catch the message, but they're completely clueless. They have no idea what he's talking about. Jesus is leading the way. Disciples are astonished, while those who followed are afraid. People are scared, and the reason they're afraid is because other people have been saying that we're going to kill you, Jesus, when you get to Jerusalem. And Jesus keeps saying it, but they're not catching it. Again, he took the 12 aside. This is the third time, and told them what was going to happen to him. And now he gives them more intricate details, and he tells them, we are going to Jerusalem, he said. The Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests, the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, hand him over to the Gentiles who will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. Not only to tell him that he's going to die, but he's going to have a trial. He's going to be mocked, spit upon, wear a crown of thorns, and it's not going to work out well for me, he says. Now, watch what the disciples are doing, okay? The last time he told them the message, in the midst of the conversation, they're arguing about which one of them is the greatest. I just want you to notice the irony of what's taking place at this moment. Then James and John, that's two of the inner circle people, Peter, James, and John, which gives me such hope because the most hard-headed of all are the ones that Jesus used to do some amazing stuff later. But watch what James and John are doing. Teacher, they said, we want you to do something for us. Would you do whatever we ask? I can imagine them pulling aside. Hey, Jesus, could you slow down on your conversation for just a second? I have a question for you. There's something really important. Would you do whatever we want? And here's what they say. Hey, when you bring about your kingdom, and when you get your glory, and when you get to reign, can we have the two highest spots of honor? hey, Jesus, can we have the role where we're the most important? And think about it. At the banquet where you have the place and the position of the most honor, why do you want that place? Because everybody else is going to have to serve you, right? Can you just imagine the irony of what's going on? They completely missed his message, and they were arguing about the exact opposite thing. Let one of us sit on your right hand. You don't even know what you're asking. And Jesus brings him back, and he says, hey, I'm going to the cross, and I'm going to have to suffer. Are you sure you want to have the place of honor? Because instead of ruling and reigning, you're going to have to get rejected, suffer, and die, just like me. And they say, yeah, we're up for the honor stuff. Give it to us. Watch what the rest of the disciples did. When the 10 heard about it, they were indignant. And they weren't mad because James and John were asking the question. They were mad because they never thought of it. They never thought about pulling Jesus aside and saying, hey, can we have the place of honor? Can we have the place where we get to be exalted, where we get to be in charge? Jesus called them together, and I can imagine Jesus' frustration. I only got a few days. We're on our way to Jerusalem, and when I get there, they're going to arrest me and kill me. And you guys are still fighting about honor and position and power and who's in charge, and you're arguing about who's the greatest. So what Jesus does is he tells them how life really works. Verse 42, Jesus called them together and he said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority. Hey, the way it works in the real world, I'm not clueless, I understand this, is the people who have power use their power to exercise it to get what they want. The people who are in charge make sure everyone knows that they're in control, and they use their power so everybody else has to serve them. But watch these 4 words, because they change everything. I know how the rest of the world works, Jesus says. I know that if you have power, then you can leverage your power to get what you want. But read these with me, okay? These are the only words I'm going to make you read. We're going to read verse 43 together, and we're going to start with the word not, okay? Ready? Not so with you. That's not how it is if you're a follower of Jesus. That's not the way it is. It's not the way everyone else around you operates. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. The reason I came, Jesus said, was not to be in charge and to have rank, but was to lower myself and to become a servant and to be rejected and killed, and that's what I want you to do as well. You see, sometimes we see it through the wrong lens. Jesus' mission wasn't to rule, but was to go to the cross. Jesus says that if you follow me, it's not about rank where you're the first. I want you to be last. Jesus says, I want you to clearly understand that your role is instead of to be served and exercise my authority and be the one in charge, I want you to be the servant of everyone. Now, here's the scary part, okay? This is the part where we get practical for just a second. Can you imagine if you did what Jesus said? Oftentimes, the reason that there's difficulty in your family is you're arguing about your rights and who's in charge and why aren't you treating me well? Can you imagine if we listened to Jesus just for a little bit and did what he said, how much harmony that may bring? I read a statement that made me just sit in my chair and think for a while, and I want to read it to you. But I put something kind of cool because we need a little levity to really process this. Isn't that baby cool? Sometimes you need to look at things from a different perspective. You will know whether a person is a servant or not by the way they act when they're treated like one. The reason that some of us have such a hard time is because we want to be in charge. We want to be the one doling out the orders. And when someone else treats us like a servant, we have a sense of deep indignation, like, how dare you do that? But just imagine that if instead of coming to it about leveraging your power to get you what you want, that you are leveraging your power to give somebody else what they want. Imagine if you go to the relationship with your husband or your wife, and instead of saying, serve me, meet my needs, you say, hey, I'm here so that I can serve you and meet your needs. Those of you that are single, imagine if you did that with your friends. Now, here's something to think about before you dismiss what Jesus says, because I know it's not the common wisdom of the day. Who's the most happy people you know? Are they the people that are constantly demanding that everybody else give them what they want? Are they the person that has already chosen to be the servant? Because nobody else can make you feel horrible when you already have that position. What about you? What lens do you see through? Do you see through the lens of wanting to get the crown? Or are you willing to go to the cross? The thing that's pretty cool is God is more than willing to exalt those that take the right path. And we sang a very powerful song that was based in Philippians chapter 2 that says, there's a day coming when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess to the glory of God that Jesus Christ is Lord. And one day he is going to rule and reign on this earth. But that's not how he came. He came as a humble servant that was willing to do what God wanted, and one day God will exalt him to the place that he truly wants to be. And some of you are wanting to get the crown, but you're not willing to accept the cross. Just consider it. I'm not asking you to completely change everything. What if for 1 week you just tried it a little bit and said, okay, I'm going to, instead of it being all about me, I'm going to make part of the day about somebody else and just see how it goes. I think that God is waiting to exalt some of you, but he's waiting for you to be humbled first. One of the things that was always painful for me growing up was that my dad was never completely pleased with me. He was never, ever happy. If I got a 98 on a test, he would say to me, Bob, why didn't you work really hard and get 100? And even after I was married, we would have painful conversations. And even when I was in my 30s, I always knew whenever I went to my dad's house, he was going to give me a lecture. And this is what the lecture would look like. He would say, Bob, when are you going to become a real pastor? And since I was an associate pastor, not the head pastor, he would give me a lecture on the 5 things I needed to do to move myself up on the chain. He would say to me, here's the things you need to do so that people will recognize you and they will see you as a person of authority and they will see you as worth something. And every time we went, it was like a combination of agony and misery because my dad would be oftentimes just saying, Bob, when are you going to get it so that you understand what true authority is about? But fortunately for me, I wasn't listening to my dad's voice because I had already heard about a Savior that came to this earth, and he has an upside-down kingdom. And it doesn't matter if anybody sees me as a person of authority because I have already chosen to be a servant. And I'm asking you to consider doing the same. Would you pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, my heart's prayer is that we would see your heart. That who you are is a gracious, kind God that wants something from us, not something that doesn't want something from us, but wants to give us something. And you know how life really works. You're not clueless. You understand how authority works. And what you're asking us to do is to be last and to be the servant. Give us the courage to carry it out. And let us experience the benefits of doing so. In Jesus' precious and holy name, amen.